Hi, Pages Past listeners, editing Genna here. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know this episode is a little different. It was the very first episode we recorded, and we had not fully fleshed out the idea for the show. So the format is a little different, and the closing question segment didn't have the name it has today. It wasn't Shelf or Stacks. It was called Weed It or Read It, which is really hard to say, and which we ditched. Also, some time has passed, and Will's podcast, Elwood City Limits, has actually wrapped, although there's a great archive for you to explore. Finally, I need to warn you that my microphone was actually disconnected for parts of this episode, so you are going to have to bear with us through some audio issues. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy the episode. Here's Will Young reading Pet Sematary by Stephen King.
Louis Creed, who had lost his father at 3 and who had never known a grandfather, never expected to find a father as he entered his middle age, but that was exactly what happened. Although he called this man a friend, as a grown man must do when he finds the man who should have been his father relatively late in life. He met this man on the evening he and his wife and his 2 children moved into the big white frame house in Ludlow. Winston Churchill moved in with them. Church was his daughter Eileen's cat.
Welcome to Pages Past, the podcast where we visit the Library of Memory. I'm Genna Buck. In each episode, I invite a guest to choose a book from their far past to read and discuss. Through conversation and close reading, we'll find new meanings in our old favorite books. My guest is Will Young, host of the incredible Elwood City Limits podcast, the authoritative podcast for scholars of the PBS Kids TV show Arthur. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Jenna. I'm very happy to be here.
I am so excited to have you on. You have chosen Pet Sematary by Stephen King, a book that is formative for a lot of people, and you encountered it as a teenager. I encountered it just now for the first time, and I can appreciate it on an artistic level. I can tell that it is expertly done, and it's very rich text. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about it. When we first decided to do Pet Sematary, Will recorded some initial thoughts in a voice note. Take a listen.
Hello, my name is William Young, and the book that I am looking back on is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Pet Sematary was not the first of his that I read, but it was among the first. I read it when I would have probably gotten to it at least by age 16, probably still 15. I remember thinking that it was the scariest book I ever read. I have a very visceral sense memory with reading it. There's a part, I believe it's maybe a quarter of the way through, where the main character is walking towards the pet cemetery or is kind of walking in the woods. And the way that it was described in the book really, it really messed with me. I remember feeling like I was there. And that was a feeling that not a lot of books had been able to inspire in me before. The sense of being in a scene to the point where I almost felt under threat from ghostly forces myself. And it wasn't a boo scary scene. It was more meant to inspire dread. I'm really hoping that it's as scary as it was when I was a kid. Admittedly, it probably won't be, but that's okay. At least when I was a teenager, I considered it one of my favorite books. I'm hoping that my recent greater context of the career of Stephen King and the works of Stephen King and the books that I've read since then and the media that I have consumed in some way since then will inform how I feel about Pet Sematary. So I'm really looking forward to reading it again and looking forward to speaking about it.
During our first conversation, Will had just started diving back into Pet Sematary, and I was still hyping my scaredy cat self up to start reading it. Here is a little bit of that conversation. It's a difficult text for me. This is not something that I could describe as fun. I found this very, very hard to get through. I'm a scaredy cat, but also like it's just deeply upsetting. On top of being scary, it's grim and gruesome. Was that what appealed to you? Do you remember why you liked it so much?
The scare of it was a big part of it that I remember reading and then kind of looking up and looking around and being like, did I just hear something? Oh man, like just, but by the pure description alone, I was sucked into it, which I didn't think a book could possibly even do. So it was the scary part of it, and the nature of the story itself has always really fascinated me because we all have a relationship with death in one way or another, and this speaks to the one that I have, which is not necessarily a good thing. It might not even be a bad thing, but it is it is what it is. So I think that's what has kept it in my mind.
Help me picture young Will at this time when this book crossed your path. What was going on in your life at that point, and how did the book kind of intersect with that?
So 15, that was my first part-time job. It was for what used to be called Empire Theaters, which was the Maritimes-based theater chain. I want to say that was probably, fall of 2005 into right before summer 2006. I was only there for about 6 months. So that was my first paycheck. It was my first money that I earned from working. So I had a bunch of disposable income. I didn't really know what to do with it. I had already bought CDs, bought DVDs, and I was like, well, buy some books, I guess. And at that point, I was into like Harry Potter when it first came out. I read Lord of the Rings because the movies came out. I was getting more into comics and graphic novels. And I think that I just wanted to read Stephen King. Like I'd never really seen any of his movies, but I wanted to read the books, and they seemed interesting when I looked at them on the shelf. And I bought somewhere between like 5 and 7 books, like just really those small trade paperbacks. And one of them was Pet Sematary. And it was purely like, which one of these looks interesting just from the title, because I didn't know much about Stephen King at that point, or I'd heard of like Carrie, so I bought Carrie. I heard of It, so I bought It. But I just kind of bought these and was just like, yeah, sure, like we'll see if I like any of them. And then most of the editions I bought that day, I still own. They're very worn at this point, but I still have most of them.
And what was 15-year-old Will like? What do you think about why that appealed to you?
I was very religious. I got big time into being Catholic when I was 14. And then this was the big year that it really took off because there was a local youth ministry started up. That was a community that I found when I needed it, because I was in a situation where I was isolated. I didn't have very close friends in that grade 9 class. And I was also going through puberty and feeling a lot of feelings. So I felt that I didn't have my group as close anymore. So I started going to my local church. They started holding like youth group. And then through that, the youth ministry became stronger. And then I just kind of based my identity around that for a long time. But there were still parts of my personality that didn't necessarily gel with being a young Christian teenager. Part of that was like, I really liked horror movies. I really liked scary stuff. I liked, violent professional wrestling. And I think there was just a curiosity as I was now a teenager, and I was like, oh, I can like rent movies that are past PG-13. I can like watch horror movies on TV or whatever. And I was like, let me see what Stephen King's all about. There was always an interest there that was somewhat counter to the religious group of friends and community that I was fostering.
I was going to say, you brought home a handful of these books, and Pet Sematary has a perverse relationship to like Christian symbolism and Christian ideas.
Yeah.
And it perverts the idea of resurrection in an intensely grotesque way. And as a teenager, were you encountering this as something that was thrilling or as something that was maybe kind of taboo?
I don't think I even really fully appreciated it at the time. Something that made Pet Sematary stick out to me is that I once in junior high had a friend of mine, one of my friends who I got separated from, basically recite the movie to me.
Okay, yeah.
Because I had never seen it before. This is at a time on the internet where this is coming back to me as I talk about it. So I was really interested in horror movies, but I was still a little scared to get into them because there was an element of it where it still felt real.
Yep.
I went on a lot of like horror movie websites. I don't remember the name of the one that I would go to all the time, but it was one where it's just like they would collect like the most well-known horror movies and some like off the beaten path ones. So that's where I found out about some Italian horror movies, or that's where I found out about The Exorcist and stuff like that. Mid 2000s was like, oh, you can download an MP3 clip of a line from the movie, or like here's a bunch of images or screen captures or what have you. And that's the most that you could do. But I was reading about it and it was forming in my imagination what these films were. And I think one of them was Pet Sematary. And then I had my friend kind of recite the movie to me, and I was like, this sounds like the greatest movie ever made. It was scary, but it was thrilling. But I was just like, yeah, you put the body in the ground, body comes back, okay,
sick zombies. Yeah.
Ooh, scary. So the religious perversity didn't even really, I'm just like, yeah, cool, scary, zombie, whatever, as a 15-year-old would probably interpret that.
If we were trying to read this through a theme or themes, what theme would you want to do?
The theme that I went with that sticks out to me as being particularly resonant is responsibility.
Interesting.
Responsibility is something that influences the actions. There is a sense of tragedy in the story, but the best tragedies show you not that this is going to happen no matter what, because it's a story. Everything's going to happen no matter what. But it gives you the feeling that this could have changed if they had made a different decision. Like the best versions of this are when you're just praying that maybe this time they won't make that mistake, but they do every time.
We could read responsibility onto any of these characters. And I think you could have like a good debate over the extent that like the malevolent force within the Pet Sematary is controlling their actions or isn't. It seems like questions of free will are kind of embedded in this story in a really interesting way.
And it's funny because as I'm going through Stephen King's bibliography, the funny thing is that he will never waste an opportunity to tell you exactly what's going on. And I understand this completely as somebody who feels that I have to like justify every action that I make to everybody. But there are some ways in which he kind of hammers the point home, but there are other ways in which the force in the Pet Sematary exists that he just never expands on, and he shouldn't feel that he has to, because that's what makes it scary.
Before we go any further, let's drop this book into history and recap it for those who haven't read it, or more likely, haven't read it in a while. Fair warning, this is your last chance to turn back. This podcast runs on spoilers. Pet Sematary by Stephen King was published in 1983. It's now a horror classic and was adapted into a film in 1989 and has had many adaptations since. It tells the story of Lewis Creed, a doctor who moves into a house in Maine with his wife Rachel, 5-year-old daughter Ellie, and toddler son Gage. Lewis befriends his elderly neighbor Judd, who lives across the busy road from their house with his wife Norma. Together, the two families take a walk to a local curiosity, the long-standing Pet Sematary. Then, on the first day of his new job as a university campus doctor, Lewis is confronted with the gruesomely injured Victor Pascal, a student struck by a car, who in his death throes speaks to Lewis by name and warns him that the Pet Sematary is not the real cemetery, which is beyond. On Halloween that year, Judd's wife Norma has a minor heart attack, and Lewis, acting quickly, administers first aid and saves her life. Judd tells Lewis he owes him a debt. Sometime later, when Rachel and the children are away, the family cat, Church, is run over and killed. Judd takes Lewis past the Pet Sematary to the real cemetery, a Mi'kmaq burial ground touched by the monstrous legendary figure, the Wendigo, and they bury Church there. Church is resurrected as a stinking and demonic zombie cat, but still a cat. Norma Crandall dies sometime later a natural death in her sleep and is buried in a normal cemetery. Months later, Gage is run over and killed on the same busy road. Lewis sends his wife and daughter away and, driven by an irresistible force, buries his son in the demonic cemetery. Gage is resurrected, and he starts speaking, saying terrible things, and he kills both the Creed's neighbor Judd and his own mother, Rachel, who he also eats part of. Lewis, now completely insane, kills Gage and Church and sets Judd's house on fire. He buries Rachel in the cemetery, convinced in his madness that the result will be different this time. In the last scene, she returns home to him, resurrected, speaking with her mouth full of dirt and gravel, and puts her hand on his shoulder, saying, "Darling." And that is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And now let's dive into my second conversation with Will, now that we have both finished reading Pet Sematary. I wanted to ask you about the passage that you called out. You knew that it was kind of early in the book, and it was the walk to the Pet Sematary was something that stuck with you. Did that hit you differently on reread? And did you recognize the memorable passage when you hit it?
There's two possible ones I could have been thinking of. It was either him walking towards the Pet Sematary at night with the ghost of Pascal, or it was him and Judd walking to the real Pet Sematary. Whichever one it was. When I read it the first time, I just remember feeling a chill and just really being affected by a book more than I ever had been. And that's what really stuck with me. Now, it didn't really happen this time. This is half my life later, and I'm scared by everything, but also when it comes to horror, it takes a lot to really get under my skin. And the descriptions are really strong, but didn't quite do it for me here. But I will say that the initial walk with Judd was it's a really tremendous passage, because when I lived by myself in my mid-20s, there was a pathway through woods that was behind my apartment, and it was a really lovely walk, and you could kind of walk all the way nearly to the next town. But when it got dark, it was impossible to see through. And I remember taking that walk in October once. It was really, really chilling. It reminded me of this in a way, because the shadows play tricks on you. The noises are heightened because you have less visibility. So all of your senses are acting overdrive in a sense. And I thought it really played well to that.
Is there anything that struck you as very different than you remember? Or how did it compare?
I think the interpersonal relationships were more understandable to me this time because I'm older. I've had more experiences in my life, and I'm able to see the truth behind the dialogue between characters, the feelings held between characters. A lot of Lewis and his wife's exchanges together and his feelings about her felt more real to me because I have been married now, going on 5 years now, just in the sense of not relating to Lewis Creed necessarily, but having lived with someone for more than 10 years, having made a life together, there was a bit more common ground that I had with Stephen King in his writer's voice than I did when I was a 15-year-old child, essentially.
Yeah. I only knew a little bit about Pet Sematary, just what you absorbed from the culture, right? And I expected to find Lewis very detestable. And I really didn't. He's kind of lovable. I think that he's relatable in some ways. I would understand why some of what you would have read from him, you would feel some kinship with that, even though you're not going to resurrect your dead family members, I would hope.
Well, and that's the nature of Stephen King, and that's why he's one of the most prolific but also successful popular writers. And this is not necessarily indicative quality, because goodness knows he's had such a bibliography, it has dipped in quality many, many times. But he is able to spark that recognition in all kinds of readers, from a teenager to an adult to my mother to you to all kinds of audience segments. And that's a real strength that you can tap into to become a successful writer.
So in each episode, we choose a theme to read the text through. And you chose the theme of responsibility. Where would you like to start with that? Where do you see that theme of responsibility show up in the text?
It would have been really easy to pick grief, and I think that grief is a big part of this, but
Yeah.
I wanted to try and think a little bit outside the box. And I'm really glad that you and many other female non-binary readers have been able to get a lot out of this book, because it is very masculine in many senses. And I feel like the theme of responsibility plays into a lot of the male characters. So Lewis being the main character, grief does play into the decisions that he makes throughout the book. And it's almost a bit of, I suppose, an excuse. Grief is so all-encompassing and mind-altering in real life and in this book that it is to blame for some of mankind's worst decisions, or at least the worst decisions you can make as a human. But you also see the process in which he decides that there is nothing to do but to give into those outside influences. He is not innocent of the choices he makes. He's not absolved of the choices he makes. They all come down to him at any point in any of the bad decisions that led to the tragic end. He could have said no, and there were points where he almost did. And that's what makes it worse, not in a storytelling sense, but in the tragic sense. You can see where he could have chosen differently, and he didn't.
It certainly evokes this feeling of dread in the reader, as you just know that it doesn't have to be that way, where he first chooses to resurrect the cat, and then quickly the stakes are upped when he is pondering resurrecting his child. And I think the text invites us to try to think about who is responsible ultimately for this chain of events. And it's got some questions about almost like the nature of evil, right? Like, who started this? Whose fault is it really? And you do hear the characters talk about feeling sort of overwhelmingly drawn by this sort of supernatural evil force to commit these acts of evil. But Lewis has his wits about him, and you hear him have this internal struggle. And we also see this with Judd, this neighbor man who introduces him to the pet cemetery and originally prompts him to use it to resurrect the cat. And he says this really interesting thing about sort of making bad choices and taking responsibility. He says, you do it because it gets a hold of you. You make up reasons. They seem like good reasons, but mostly you do it because once you've been up there, it's your place and you belong to it. And you make up the sweetest smelling reasons in the world. It's also compared to characters in a horror movie who have to walk toward the monster. They seem compelled to do so. And it seems a little bit like the text is telling us that it isn't Lewis's fault, that he's been touched by a demon. And I struggle with that. Where do you read the responsibility? Like, whose fault is this?
I think that the pet cemetery's influence is a thumb on the scale in that it influences and it gives weight to the bad choices that are made. And it's less interesting if they were just mind controlled and they had no say in this. What makes this so thought-provoking to me is that at any time, any of them could have done something differently. In Judd's case, he felt a responsibility to pay Lewis back because at one point in the novel, Lewis provides emergency medical care to Judd's wife and saves her, even though she ends up dying shortly after. But the way in which he wanted to show that gratitude, to fulfill that debt, let's say, was not responsible because he showed him the pet cemetery, the real pet cemetery, and showed him how it worked and what it meant. And then that's, again, the thumb on the scale of the influence of the pet cemetery weighted that decision, but it was still his decision to make. He could have made him a macaroni pie or something, but instead he brought his cat back from the dead.
baked him a pie, changed his oil, babysat his children.
Yeah,
So many options.
absolutely. Instead, it seemed like the right idea at the time to show him this that would end up being all of their downfalls. It is certainly unfortunate because they didn't choose to live there because of the pet cemetery. It is a little bit of horrible fortune in that they all just happened to live there at that time or at all, but the responsibility was always theirs in a way.
I learned that in like the post-canonical Pet Cemetery literature, there is like a prequel to Pet Cemetery.
Hmm.
It makes this kind of argument that actually is something to do with Judd Crandall's bloodline, and he can't move away from town because something to do with his blood is tied to the land
Ugh.
and the founding families, and there's a whole like pseudo mythology around it, which like we didn't ask, we don't need it.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, unfortunately, because I watched that movie late last year, and I did not like it at all.
I was gonna say it did not get very good reviews. I think it got thoroughly Rotten Tomatoes, and you don't need to over-explain. Like the mythology here is creepy enough.
I mean, I think I used this very pithy summation in my own Letterboxd review of, I think it might have been the sequel movie that doesn't have anything to do with the book. It's darkly funny, and especially with a Pet Sematary movie having been made in the last year or so, and they're expecting that to do anything for anybody. It's just like, it's funny, darkly funny, how they keep trying to resurrect this property when the joy of it is in knowing that that's all there is. And I feel that sometimes it's unfortunate because when you love something, you want more of it. You don't want less of it, or you don't want to just be okay with what you have. And doesn't that tie back to the book in itself? You'll always want more of the things and the people that you love, but eventually you have to be okay with what you got.
The cover of my copy says, "Sometimes dead is better," which is like, that's a message of the book. Before we conclude the theme discussion, I'm wondering what you can say as someone who appreciates horror, what you get out of texts like this.
I've had anxiety all my life. I'm a very anxious person. I'm afraid of so many things, real and imagined, that are going on, that have been going on, that will go on. And it sucks. Like, it's not good. Don't recommend anxiety. If you can not have anxiety, definitely don't have it. But what horror does for me, and whether that's a movie, a video game, or in this case, a book, it allows me to live the worst case scenario in a controlled way. Because what is horror if not the worst case scenario? And it's all wonderful, imaginative, creative worst case scenarios. Imagine in our world, what if there was a spot of land where you could bury somebody and they come back to life, but they come back wrong? That is the worst case scenario for some people. It's the worst case scenario for the Creed family and for Judd and for everybody who is touched by it. And in looking at it from the safety of reading a book, of it's happening to somebody else, it's not happening to me, I can see every part of everything horrible and terrible about what's happening, and then I can close the book, or I can turn the TV off, or I can save the game and come back to it later. And that is the control I have over it. So I can allow myself to be scared, to be anxious, to be creeped out, to be grossed out. And then at the end, it's over, and I can keep living my life, and that doesn't exist anymore. We live in a lot of worst case scenarios right now in just the life and the earth that we made for ourselves. But at least it's not this bad, you know? There's also a visceral quality. Like, horror is just cool. Like, I just think it's cool. It's always sparkling with creativity and interesting relations with the darker aspects of the human condition. But it also does help everything seem a little bit brighter once you close a very intense book like Pet Sematary is. Take a breath, and you're just like, okay, my life doesn't seem so bad right now.
You know, just as you were speaking and talking about how encountering the worst can help almost bring perspective in a way, you told me once before that this book spoke to a part of you that maybe wasn't entirely captured by the identity that you had as a teen, which is that you were part of the Catholic youth movement and you were a youth group kid and, you know, quite religious. but also that you enjoyed stuff that maybe was lightly frowned upon in the Catholic youth group world, like gross horror and like violent professional wrestling. And, quite notably absent from this text is God. It is quite godless. There's a passage where Lewis talks about realizing that his daughter knew more about Spider-Man and the Burger King than she did about Moses or Jesus. And he almost like calls out the relative godlessness of this text. And there certainly isn't a loving God present in this text. And the sort of hints that we get about the afterlife are quite godless. And I was wondering if there's something about that appealed to you, or is there something about this being violently not Catholic that appealed to you about it?
I'm not sure if I even really reckoned to that. I don't think I had the tools to deal with that when I was 15 years old and going to youth group every week and very much in the faith. Living as I do now, let's just say agnostic and leave it at that. I'm tempted to say that it feels a bit more truthful, but I will also follow that up by saying I don't know if it is or not. So that's kind of where I am with that in terms of the godless nature of this book. And again, it's just like, what a cool way to describe this book is like godless. And it's like, we don't use that word enough because not every piece of horror media has that sort of feeling, but there is a very cold indifference that seems to permeate a lot of the book. And of course, it helps that Lewis Creed is a doctor and he is very scientifically minded in terms of the way that he approaches religion and the skepticism with which he views the Pet Sematary until he sees its work for himself, until he can see it and verify it with his own eyes. And then it begins to take shape to him and breaks him, as it would anybody else, regardless of their faith journey or not. Stephen King has tackled faith many, 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 many times in his works, and there are others that I can think of that are more negative, I suppose, about what lies after death. And it really makes you think of like, what is worse if there's nothing, or if what waits for us is worse for everybody. I love stories that have to do with death and life and what lies beyond, because it's such a wonderfully open topic. You can explore in any way that you feel comfortable or feel uncomfortable to do so. It's not so much, is there anything after this? It's the fear that there is nothing after this. That is part of the grief that drives Lewis to what he does. It drives Judd as well to spare us from the pain of losing someone, not even acknowledging that in their absence, they may be somewhere else. We don't get the luxury of thinking that Gage is in a better place, that he is somewhere where there is no pain anymore, because we don't know.
We're going to do close reading now. This is the part of the show where, in the words of Anna Carter Florence, we go into the text and come back when we find something true. Will, would you read the passage you have chosen for us?
Sure thing. No, Judd said, as if Lewis had simply agreed. It don't. And in his calm voice that was so sure and so implicable, in that voice which somehow put the chill through Lewis, he said, "They are secret things. Women are supposed to be the ones good at keeping secrets, and I guess they do keep a few. But any woman who knows anything at all would tell you she's never really seen into any man's heart. The soil of a man's heart is stonier, Lewis. Like the soil up there in the old Mi'kmaq burying ground. Bedrock's close. A man grows what he can, and he tends it."
So in the youth group tradition, we have chosen Lectio Divina as our reading practice. And the first step is narrative. So this is to try to identify what is literally happening at this moment in the text. What is the context here? What is the conversation?
So the conversation is one that Lewis and Judd are having. They have several long-form conversations throughout the book, and especially in the kind of first half of the book. And this one is talking about how after they buried the cat Church in the pet cemetery and he came back to life, and reckoning with what it was that Lewis and Judd did and the nature of keeping what they did a secret. And Judd talking about, again, from this very masculine perspective, what it is that men, especially men of the time that this would have come out in the 80s, what they keep inside themselves that they don't tell anybody and barely even admit to each other, and using, well, not to skip ahead here, but likening it very much to a soiled ground like they would have just come from.
And actually, right at the top of that, when he's saying, no, it don't, he's saying, no, it don't do any good to talk about things, which is such a mid-century hyper-masculine sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing you don't do is talk about your feelings. That path leads to nothing good. It's ironic now reading it, being like, maybe if somebody could have talked about their feelings, you could have done something other than gone up and done all these terrible things. I'm glad that you brought up the masculinity aspect, because it's a very rigid idea of masculinity that they espouse.
I'm a big fan of saying in my own life that masculinity is a prison in which men like me constantly have to reckon with, no more so than here, where you can kind of see, if you have this within the context of the rest of the book, of that not only is its own prison, but it's also the executioner masculinity is. Because, yeah, if there had been more supports for someone like Lewis to talk about this, if there had been more ways for Judd to feel like he could express his responsibility, his gratitude to Lewis, then maybe none of it would have happened.
And there's lots of reasons behind it, but one of the reasons Lewis is motivated to do this sacrilege with the body of a cat is that he just doesn't want to talk to his daughter about the fact that the cat died. He's just avoiding a difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty extreme way to go about that. The second step of Lectio Divina is figurative. Is there any allegory here? What metaphors can we find in this text? What are the symbols at play here, or a deeper figurative meaning? And certainly stones and rocky ground appear a lot. But I'd love to hear from you what metaphors or images you see here.
Stones, rocky ground, and soil. It's talking about its own field, garden, cemetery, perhaps. It's certainly, in this case, what a man is like on the inside, and how, at the end of the day, at least in this way of thinking, they are their own caretakers. Because with the sentence, a man grows what he can and he tends it. It's not just that a man is his own burying ground, his own garden. He is also the one who tends it. He is the gardener. He is the caretaker. And that is also symbolic of what they were doing by burying the bodies in the pet cemetery.
One of the most interesting things about this passage is that it is repeated so many times in so many different parts of the text, usually at moments of struggle, of strife, of having to make a difficult decision. And particularly those little phrases, a man's heart is stonier, and a man grows what he can and he tends it. It is repeated when Lewis is taking care of Norma Crandall, who is sick unto death, when he is struggling over the various lies and concealments and struggling about the choices about whether to resurrect the cat and later the child. And then when he's daydreaming about having his son back, he says these things, and it's even spoken to him by the dying Victor Pascal at one point. So this is something that we're supposed to think about, and that is supposed to resonate for us like throughout different parts of the text. And I was wondering if any of those really stuck out to you, or what you make of this repetition that happens throughout Pet Sematary.
So the repetition, it just reminds me of, as many things do, of a Simpsons quote of Marge being like, if you repeat something, then it's easier for people to remember. This town is a part of us all, a part of us all, a part of us all. But in this case, it is an accessible way to get that theme across. And the way that you and I are in the midst of interpreting it here are certainly not the only way that you can think about it, depending on your own journey or how these images relate to you in your own life. So I think that it's left wonderfully open by the sense of, like, you know, soil, ground, stone. It's all very broad, I suppose. And that's what can help it successfully reach more people.
It's a rich text, in other words. You could read a really different meaning onto it if you want. And you said it could reflect differently on different people's lives, which that is actually the next step of Lectio Divina, which does anything in this speak to you as being relevant in your own life or remind you of anything in real life?
I mean, the masculine experience, let's say. Certainly a lot of this feels familiar. It's couched in a much more artful way than this is normally impressed upon to younger boys, to men throughout their lives. What really strikes me is that this is, of course, from Judd, who is an old man in the early 80s, really 70s, because King wrote this when he was much younger. So he would have been writing it from that perspective. So a much, much older perspective from Judd's character, where there is such a finality to, this is the way that a man has to be. This is the way that things are. Even speaking to the role of women in relation to men and just being like, this is how it is. And thankfully, we don't live with such rigidity anymore. It still exists, certainly, but it's good that we're beginning to question and prod at these hard lines in the way that we interact with gender and with each other as gendered people in this world. So what really strikes me is that even though this is said from a character with authority in this story, you read it and it's almost as doomed as the story itself, because it's very final. There's no way around it. The soil of a man's heart is stonier. This is just one character's perspective, but he speaks with a degree of authority to Lewis in a time of need. Lewis looks to Judd as explicitly the father figure that he never had. So he takes this to heart, clearly. And it's just a shame that we ever had to have people, men or otherwise, think in this kind of hardline way about each other and about themselves.
It's so limiting. The text tells us that Judd was born with the century. So I think we're supposed to think that he was born in 1900. And it's so interesting to me to think about someone who was born in 1900, but still walking around in 1979 or whenever this is, with a totally different way of looking at gender. But you're still holding those things that you learned really young and that you internalized really young. And describing masculinity as a present is so apt here because they are so constrained by these rigid ideas of we have to deal with it because we're men and this is the only way. It really does resonate throughout the text that way. The last step at Lectio Divina is invitation. What is this text making you feel called to do, if anything?
To continue to confront this type of mentality wherever it crops up, and to resist this kind of hardline thinking. Certainly when I would have been reading this at a younger age, hardline thinking entered into my way of life quite regularly. But now I'm far more comfortable with not taking a book at face value and interrogating how I feel about something that a character says, because the trap with Judd is that he is so trustworthy, he is so loving, and he comes at every action that he does from a very good place. But sometimes, as with people in real life that you love and respect and listen to, you come to misunderstandings, you come to just places where there will never be a common ground. It is too bad that we have to come here with a character who is portrayed in such a wonderful way for the most part, but then you come to these edges and you realize that there is no way that we can be everything for everybody, and there will always be ways in which we depart from the people that we love. And I mean that in terms of mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And we never really get a chance to reckon with that in this book, because that's not what this is about. But yeah, it doesn't have to mean just because you can extend that to a person in your life. You can even just say with this story, Pet Sematary, do I agree with everything it says? No. And maybe there was a time where it's like, well, this is my favorite book, so I have to agree with everything it says, right? But now I'm old enough to know that you can hold so many truths within you at one point, and you don't have to base yourself off of the things that you love. You are not the things that you love. So you have to be your own person, and that's where I depart from it in this way, and I'm glad for it. I'm glad that I can arrive at that decision.
Yeah, I'm glad too. I really think that is a millennial disease, isn't it? Like really identifying with our cultural products to the point of being a bit blind to their flaws and our flaws as reflected in them. Well, we could definitely come up with some examples of that, of people being, this is my book or this is my show, which means that I have to have allegiance to it. And that can, can lead to really bad places. Thanks for doing Lectio Divina with me.
Happy to. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to.
So we're nearing the end of our conversation, and I have a couple of questions to close us out. The first one is, can you try to commune with 14 or 15-year-old Will when he was encountering this text? How do you think he took it versus what you are now?
Slow down when you're reading. It's that classic conundrum of there's so many things that I wish I could have done differently, but then it wouldn't have led me to here. Seriously, like there's so much more, so much more books to be read, and they deserve more time. It's just hard to compete with them when there's TV and video games and stuff like that, especially when I'm not medicated and, loud sounds and bright colors are so much more immediately interesting. So I don't begrudge my younger self for not necessarily taking the time to read through books. It is what it is, or it was what it was, I should say. I've always been driven by the desire to see the next best thing, whether that's a movie or a book or a game or a wrestling match or whatever, the next best thing of whatever it is that I love. And I always hope to be driven by that because it will lead me to places like Pet Sematary, which for a while was the best thing I'd ever read. I don't necessarily know if that's true anymore. I'd have to really think about it. But now I want to try and find the next Pet Sematary for me. What is it going to be that I look back in another 15 years and say, well, I thought that was my favorite book at the time, but now I think it's this, because what a wonderful invitation that is from yourself at any age to just keep going. And it's like, I found this book when I was 15. It's the best thing I ever read. And I dare you to find something better. What a wonderful call that is, because you may not, but you may. And then if you do, that can change your life all over again.
What a fun adventure to try. Like, what a quest to go on.
Yes.
Find a book that's even more meaningful than this was to you at the time. There's so much out there. So that's a whole life's work as a reader. And that leads right into our very last question, the question that we ask at the end of every episode. Read it or read it. Read it is what librarians do when they decide that something no longer needs to be shelved, but might go into the archive. We're not going to get rid of it, but we're not necessarily going to actively promote it or put it in front of readers anymore. And we have to weed collections to make room for new things. But some things become classic. Some things are sort of eternal on the shelf. And I'm wondering from you, where do you land with Pet Sematary? Are you read it or read it?
Read it. Definitely. But I think that even if it's something that you don't necessarily love, it's not going to take up too much of your time. And I think it's also worth it to read books like this that are not particularly quote unquote fun. Like, I had fun reading this, but that's my own sensibilities. Yours may vary. But I think it's valuable to read books like this just to see how you feel about it. And I should turn that lens on myself as well. I think it's important to read books, interact with media that is not necessarily what you think would be interesting to you. Because sometimes it can surprise you, and sometimes the next best thing is in somewhere where you would never look for it. So, yeah, I would absolutely recommend people read this. I say this with a lot of different things, but I will say that I don't think it's the best Stephen King book, but it is my favorite.
Well, Will, thank you so much for this. Would you like to plug anything, any of your projects before we let you go?
Certainly. So I do have my own podcast, and that is called Elwood City Limits. Myself and my co-host, we are still having fun doing it. It's still a blast. And we talk about cartoon and animated shows from our childhood and other shows that were made for young children. I will also say that I have a blog about professional wrestling. If that's something that you would like to read, creativecontrolpw.wordpress.com, and you can see my writing on this subject that I feel very, very passionately about. And also you can follow at ECL Podcast on Twitter. We have a link tree there with all of the other places you can find us: Facebook, Instagram, what have you. But those are the main ones.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Will. This has been a ton of fun.
I'm so pleased that you asked me to do this. Thank you so much for having me.
Pages Past is a production of Yikes Media. It's hosted by me, Genna Buck, and produced by Caleb Buys. Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you so much for listening. Keep up with the show at pagespastcast.com or on Instagram at pagespastcast. Get early updates and free extras by joining the free Patreon at patreon.com/pagespast. That's PAST. You can also become a paying patron. Through Patreon, this project is funded and made possible by listeners like you. Thank you. Special thanks to Hillary, Alex, Robin, Sam N, Sam E, Mike Schubert, and everyone at the Stony Brook University Podcast Incubator. Questions and responses on this program are edited significantly for length and clarity. I make every effort to represent conversations faithfully. Training any automated program on this content is prohibited by the copyright holders. Until next time, I hope all your library holds come in early, and happy reading.